And as it specifically relates to China, since China is currently the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, how do you get them to do something to help the climate? Because they're a sovereign country and they frankly don't care about international agreements. So how can the international community actually get them to do something when they're holding this gun over everyone's heads?
It's not just China. It's the entire UN system, right? The UN doesn't have an army. It can't enforce international law, and international law itself doesn't always cover a lot of these things. And that is the underlying dynamic behind the difficulty of multilateral diplomacy to solve these environmental problems, which tend to be these tragedies of the commons, right? Where in the short term and in my locale, and for me personally, it's much easier to pollute and let other people deal with the consequences. And so that dynamic persists for every country, more or less. And when the climate community tried to impose legally binding targets on countries for reducing emissions back in the 90s, we got the Kyoto Protocol, which the US resoundingly rejected after Al Gore negotiated it. The US Senate voted 95-0 in a vote basically saying, we want no part of this.
But the U.S. did lower emissions over the decades, whereas China, which I believe did they sign the Kyoto Protocols? I can't remember if they did. But anyways, they have not done anything.
Yes, China did. But at the time in the Kyoto Protocol, all developing countries, including China, were completely absolved from any obligations to reduce their emissions. So they were in a different category. They didn't have to do anything at that time. So
I mean, they still put themselves in this category of a developing country. Yet at the same time, they brag about these big shiny cities, and they're the biggest,
being the second largest economy.
They've got more billionaires than almost any other country. Like they're not a developing country anymore. Yes, they have poverty, but every country has poverty, right? Dubai has poverty. Look at the people who were building all these skyscrapers. It's nonsense, right? It's a lie to say China's a developing country. And if China's not a developing country, and it's in fact closer to a developed country, then why should there be different standards for China?
The one thing I would say is this binary division between developed and developing countries over the last 20 years has obscured more than it's illuminated. All the countries of the Middle East, all the petrostates of the Gulf, who are among the richest countries in the world, are also technically classified as developing countries under that Kyoto framework. So it's really not that helpful a framework at all. Really, what you have are middle income countries, and they're determined not only by the GDP per capita alone, but also by levels of development and the strength of institutions and things like that. And I think China rightfully fits in the middle, both from the GDP standpoint and also according to those other metrics. I think what is clear and is reflected in the newer arrangement of the Paris Agreement, right? So Kyoto Protocol, 1994, 1995, that was a different world where you had the US, you had the post-Soviet countries, and then you had the so-called third world, right? Which was presumed to be universally poor. That is not the world we live in anymore. That was already acknowledged in 2015 in the Paris Agreement, where we still have this phraseology, common but differentiated responsibilities, that is meant to pay lip service to the fact that rich countries need to do more and poor countries don't need to do as much. Everyone kind of does what they can. But it removed that duality where only the rich countries reduce emissions and everyone else free rides. Now we have this world where everyone needs to reduce emissions, but they set their own targets. And it is not legally binding in the sense that the UN will come punish you, or there will be some consequences if you don't meet your targets. And that's part of the problem. The reason that approach was taken is because the other binding approach failed. The developing countries who are big emitters were completely excluded from any responsibility. The US didn't sign on.
But did lower its emissions because of pressure from the population.
And even many of the countries that did sign on, like Australia, UK, Canada, they did not meet their targets. And so, because the binding approach to these climate negotiations quite visibly failed, whether it was the countries who were in or the countries who were out, no one reduced their emissions, and it didn't solve the problem. They switched to a different approach in Paris in 2015, whereby countries advanced their own targets, and they self-validated, self-policed. The idea was you needed to be transparent. There would be peer pressure, so that if you put forward a really weak emissions reduction target, the court of public opinion and international diplomacy would punish you for it, but there was no binding mechanism. And that is the world that we live in. And because there is no enforcement mechanism, it really is either countries just doing it in their own interest, or not doing it at all in most cases. And that's really the challenge, is how do you bring about this world where we actually have ambitious climate targets and we meet them? And there's really no way to push around a country like China and get them to do anything else than exactly what they want to do themselves.
So I feel like the way things, like, I understand why they changed it, but now the current idea is everyone sets their own targets and there are no consequences for failing to meet them anyway, right? Like, imagine applying that to, like, you work at a company as an employee and you set your own productivity targets, and even if you don't meet them, like, there's no consequences. And so, like, I feel like if you understand human nature at a basic level, you understand that this is going to fail.
It's very hard to argue with your logic. If you get your bonus, whether you get out of bed or not, then I think you're probably not going to show up for work. And that is climate diplomacy in a nutshell, I think one can say.
You brought up, like, it's very hard to hold China accountable, right? Because they're not beholden to this public pressure in the same way.
Well, yeah, they don't have a free country, so there's no way the Chinese population can push for greener technology the way that is happening now in the US.
Right. And it's very difficult for the developed countries, even like if the United States, let's say the Biden administration really, really wants to have China reduce its carbon and methane emissions. But, like, we're still doing business with them, right? And China is now, here's the irony. Like, China's building all this, like, solar panels and wind turbines
Big
and
EV
electric
industry.
vehicles, right? I mean, Chinese electric vehicles have exploded. I mean, in terms of quantity, possibly also individual cars have exploded, but like all over Europe, Australia, like, all these Chinese EVs are everywhere, right? And maybe it's only a matter of time before we see them in the US, although currently it's clearly Tesla dominating here. But like, with all this solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries that are being produced in China, right? Like, I guess my question is,
well, are you saying that, like, China is powering this green energy industry with coal? So by using this, the climate fear, they are able to create a market to sell their stuff that is powered by coal. So, and with, coal targets they don't have to follow. So they're making money and still destroying the environment. And it's like, it's not going anywhere.
It's not untrue, But I think it's also important to recognize that other countries are doing similarly, meaning that lots of countries have fossil fuels representing a very, very large chunk of their power mix. And you talk about power intensive sectors like manufacturing, and it's going to have a carbon footprint. Now, that begs the question, should we not build all this stuff? Because even the building of it for the green economy is going to have a big carbon footprint. People have done the math, and I think in most cases, you still do that because we need to turn over our capital stock, so that ultimately we decarbonize as well, but then we have the green economy to go with it. But it's an important point that we can't pretend that building stuff for the new economy, the low carbon economy, the circular economy, environmentally friendly, does not itself have an environmental footprint.